My parents abandoned me when I was 4 and now they want me back. I've been living with my aunt and uncle since I can't remember when. I got so used to living with them that I began to see them as my parents. They had 2 other children, but I was the older one of the 3 of us. I took them as my siblings, and they didn't know better. This was because when I came into their lives, my aunt was pregnant with Demon. She ended up having him when I was about 4, and I became his brother automatically. 3 years after Demon, Daniela came along. Daniela was unlike Demon in every possible way one could think of. While Demon was reserved and only spoke when he wanted to bombard you with questions, Daniela was the curious one and would ask questions almost every time. Of course, my aunt got tired of her and would usually tell her to come meet me and direct her questions to me. I always ended up providing answers to all of her questions. It became a war when I didn't give her the answer she wanted. She would scream, and all over the house. No one would be able to do anything until she was calm once again. Demon was also curious, but he was more of a silent observer. He knew what things went on around the house but would only mention them when they related to something he needed an answer to. For instance, there was a time he asked my aunt, whom I called Mom, why people on television could get cruel. My aunt asked what he meant, and he explained that he had seen someone cry while watching a movie and couldn't help but wonder what evil the person could have done. This cracked my mom, dad, and me up. It wasn't just his question that I found funny but his confused expression while we laughed at his hilarious question. Mom had to take the time to explain to him, and when he still wasn't getting it, Dad had to step in. Still, Demon only provided more questions for us. I eventually had to step in and tell him that it wasn't every movie that made people cry and that people cried because they could relate well to the stories. Such was the kind of happy relationship that existed between my mom, dad, and my 2 siblings. My parents were the most passionate and fun people in the world, and I mean this literally. Something happened when I was about 10 that made me realize that they would do anything for me. Prior to these times, I knew I wasn't their biological child, but I couldn't wrap my head around why I stayed with them. There was this time we went camping, and something terrible almost happened to me. I had gone with a friend of mine to the lakeside after so much persuasion. I had this phobia for water, but I didn't want to disappoint him. I have a thing for going the extra mile for people even at my detriment, so I went with him. The next thing I remembered was finding myself on a hospital bed. I didn't remember anything that happened, but for the first time, I feared that Mom and Dad would punish me by taking me back to where I was from. I continued pleading with them because I couldn't imagine not being around them for a minute. They didn't say anything initially but kept nudging me to go back to sleep. I did, and when I awoke, there was a cake and some other things on my bed. Turned out that it was my birthday. I had totally forgotten about it because I was so worried that they were mad at me. They then told me that they were never mad at me, and it wasn't my fault that I got pushed into the water by the other boy. Since that incident happened, I was so sure that my parents loved me even beyond ways I could think of. Our bond became stronger over the years. Dad and Mom became my go-to. Whenever I had any issues, I went to them, and they sorted it out. It might take a while, but they did everything they could. Suddenly, when I turned 17, I noticed that Dad and Mom were beginning to have issues, even though it was some kind of low-key thing. I would hear them murmuring from my bedroom, and they would do this until late at night. At first, I thought that it was just some kind of work-related issue because Mom and Dad never had that sort of argument at all. In the years that I have lived with them, never for once have I heard them have an argument that would make them raise their voices at each other or even escalate into a fight. I pretended like I didn't know what was happening while hoping that whatever it was would die down eventually. The first week passed and then the second, but nothing changed really. In fact, their voices graduated from mere murmurings to actual speaking. I didn't need to put my ears close to their door to hear them clearly. I didn't know whether to broach the topic with them or not. I tried thinking about what could have gone wrong, but I kept arriving at a cul-de-sac. One day became 1 week and then 2 weeks. Then one day, I was supposed to have my music class, but my tutor was ill, and I returned home earlier. From the door, I could hear their voices, and I paused to listen to them. I couldn't make out some words, but I knew they were talking about letting someone know the truth about their biological parents. I heard my name, and then knocked off a flower pot mistakenly. Just had to go in and tell them I was eavesdropping on their conversation. They looked remorseful, and none of them spoke to me for a while. Mom only motioned for me to have a seat. After sighing, Dad told me that there was something I needed to know. He said they had been keeping it from me all the while to protect me but thought it was best to let me know since I was no longer a child. The other reason they wanted me to know was that there was an issue that needed to be sorted as soon as possible. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, and my armpits suddenly began to itch while beads of sweat lined my forehead. What was so important that would make Mom and Dad so serious? I asked myself while trying to pretend like I wasn't so tense. Mom began by asking me whether I knew that they were not my biological parents. It was immediately she said this that I knew that something was definitely wrong. Mom had never asked this sort of question ever, and I didn't imagine her asking unless something serious about my biological parents surfaced like now. I could only nod. That was enough for her, and she continued. I couldn't help but wonder where the talk was headed. Next, she asked whether I knew who my biological parents were. I told her yes because I had a picture with my biological mom and dad in my room. Then she asked whether I knew when I began living with them and why I stayed with them. I didn't have the answer to these questions. Truthfully, I had wanted to ask mom and dad these questions, but I thought it had to be a sensitive issue since they hadn't told me about it all the while. I told mom that I didn't know why I stayed with them, nor did I know when I began living with them. Mom then told me that she was going to tell me the story of my actual parents, but she clarified that my parents were alive and healthy. She then started by telling me that my mom and her used to be very close while growing up. She was the older one and got married before her. But then, she didn't have a child early, but my biological mom had her first child, me, 1 year after she got married. She told me that she had personally thought that my biological mom was too young and not ready for a marriage, but that suggestion had gone on deaf ears. I was the only child of my parents, and for the period that it was just me, everything went on just fine. That was until my baby sister came into the picture. The thing about Kyla was that she had a high risk of not surviving birth. The doctor told my biological mom this when she got pregnant with her. Yeah, my mom was pretty scared and worried and told it to my aunt. But my aunt was able to calm her down and assure her that everything was going to be fine and that Kyla would be a happy baby. True to my aunt's words, Kyla came out just fine. But the doctor was not done with his bad news. She told my mom that Kyla was most likely not going to live for more than 2 years. My aunt said my mom would tick the boxes on the calendar for each day she awoke and saw that Kyla was alive. She continued doing this until Kyla turned 1 and then 2. It was becoming more difficult to take care of Kyla because she was such a happy and curious baby. And then with me in the picture, it seemed almost impossible to watch the both of us. My aunt said my biological mom would often come over to her house with me and sometimes forget to take me back home. She did it not once or even twice. She did it to the point where my aunt was used to having me around the house. Sometimes, she would come back for me later at night, and some other times, she would send a text to my aunt that she would be dropping me off for the night. Then one day, my biological mom dropped me off and never came back for me. My aunt told me that she had first mentioned that she would be going for a concert and couldn't bear the responsibility of looking after 2 children. Kyla was enough trouble for her, and adding me to it would be more like a death wish. My aunt understood and told her to come for me the next day because she would be going on an office trip and couldn't take me along. The next day, my bio mom didn't come around, and she was suddenly unreachable. She waited, and when she couldn't, had to take me along with her. She didn't hear anything from my biological mom until about 3 days later. She apologized and said she was going to come for me, but she never showed up. When my aunt got tired of asking her to come pick me up, she connected the dots and saw that my mom was not ready to take care of me. And because she didn't have a child of her own then, it wasn't a big deal welcoming me into their home. To say that I was pissed after listening to them would be an understatement. I was so livid I would have punched the wall if it weren't for my dad. I asked them how they could have a kid and dump them without caring to stop by. All the while, I thought something bad happened to my parents that my aunt and her husband tried to conceal from me. I didn't know that they were somewhere in the city living their lives like I didn't exist. Acting on impulse, I went to my room and brought down the picture of me when I was 2 with my parents. Mom and dad tried to pacify me, and after a while, I listened to them and was calm. But I was nonetheless angry, disappointed, and heartbroken too. My dad mentioned something about my biological parents coming over the next week to say hi to me, but I wasn't sure I heard them well. I was in my own world, thinking about how cruel they must have been to dump me in the care of someone else without paying or contributing to my upkeep and welfare. Not even coming to check on me to see how I was doing, how I had grown and other things like that. The following week, my biological mom came around. She came with my sister, Kyla, who was holding a gift for me. I was more than delighted to see her, but I wasn't sure I could talk to my mom just yet. I spoke to Kyla for a while and asked how things were with her. She was 15 and was a bright young girl. We spoke like we had known each other for years, even though we only barely began speaking to each other. After a while, my aunt asked me to be seated and hear my mom out. Of course, my mom began by apologizing and saying that she didn't mean to dump me with her sister just like that. I wanted to scream out at that point that I knew everything that happened and that she had literally dumped me, but I kept my cool. She said that she was so scared for Kyla and couldn't handle the both of us, so she decided to bring me to her sister. I listened to her speak for a while and wondered where exactly she was headed with her elaborate speech. After a while, she said that she had come to take me since Kyla was now 15 and she was no longer scared of her dying or something. I didn't realize that I laughed out loud until she stopped and looked me in the eyes. I mean, did she think I was just some entity that could be moved from one place to the other? I had emotions that should be considered before she decided on making any decisions. For instance, I had literally grown up calling my aunt and her husband mom and dad, and she just wasn't going to take that away like that. My aunt asked what my thoughts were, and I told her that I needed time to forgive my biological mom for abandoning me, but I wasn't going anywhere with her. Not then and not in the future. With that said, I called Kyla out to my room. I didn't know when she left, but when Kyla and I came downstairs, she was nowhere in sight. My aunt told me to find a way to forgive her, but I told her it wasn't easy for me. She couldn't just walk out of my life and come in at any time she wanted. But then I told her I would eventually let it go but needed time to cool off. Throughout the week, I had a hard time focusing on anything. At school, the teacher noticed that I barely spoke, and that was very much unlike me. Even my friends could tell that something was wrong. My best friend asked what was going on, and I explained to her. Told her how my parents decided to show up in my life after dumping me for so many years. Talking to her was the relief I needed. Somehow, it felt like a heavy burden had been lifted from my shoulders. She encouraged me to forgive my parents because we were all humans and had our flaws. My biological mom came with my dad the next time. I poured out my heart to them that I wasn't pleased with the fact that they dumped me with my aunt so many years ago without looking back and suddenly came into it when they wanted. My biological mom got really emotional and apologized. She mentioned that she wasn't truly ready for marriage at the time she got married to my dad. It was because she felt really overwhelmed that she had to leave me with her sister. I also couldn't hold back my tears when my dad mentioned that he felt really guilty about their actions, but then he couldn't do anything because he was also overwhelmed. He also broke down crying, and I joined him. We ended up settling everything that day. My biological dad mentioned that prior to their original intention of taking me away from my aunt, I could continue to stay there for as long as I wanted, and that they would continue to check on me. I also told them that I would check on them as well, know where they stayed, and also spend some time with them. My parents and Kyla spent the night with us. It was a happy family reunion for all of us. Demon and Daniela made friends easily with Kyla. In fact, it was a difficult task trying to get them out of Demon's room when dinner was ready. My biological mom and my aunt told us some stories of when they were younger while we dined. Everyone laughed at the particular story my mom told of how they tried to catch a chicken and ended up in a pigsty. The next week happened to be Kyla's birthday. To celebrate, we went to the zoo. Well, it was what Kyla wanted. The irony of it was that she wasn't able to see any of the animals in the zoo because she was too afraid. She could only watch them from a distance even though we got assurance that they were enclosed. It was less than 30 minutes later when Kyla pleaded that we left the place. We had the most memorable birthday celebration. Happiness was written all over Kyla's face, and seeing her happy made me happier. Now, even though I still live with my aunt, my parents and I are very cool, and they stop by sometimes and other times I go over to them.